Health centers are overburdened, children are malnourished, and doctors are helpless.
If you cripple the infrastructure of a country, that's a death sentence on a massive scale.
What do you know about sanctions?
We are imposing sanctions.
The UK is sanctioning the following sanctions.
Sanctions.
I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions.
What do they do? How they work? And why did US President Woodrow Wilson once call them a weapon more tremendous than war?
To punish Saddam Hussein for invading Kuwait and to make sure he doesn't do anything like that again or worse, the UN imposed sanctions on Iraq, the harshest, most comprehensive sanctions in modern times.
Most people don't realize what's going on. Babies that are a third of their recommended weight.
Before 1990, before the war and before these sanctions, was this all unheard of in this country?
Yeah, yes.
Did not exist at all.
Didn't exist.
500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Sanctions have been around in one form or another for as long as humans have recorded history. From the siege of Megiddo in the 15th century BC, in which Egyptians encircled the Canaanites until they surrendered, to the Peloponnesian War a millennium later, in which Athenians banned commerce with the merchants of Megara. But through the technological revolution of the past half-century, this blunt economic weapon has been honed and sharpened, both expanded in its use and targeted in its application. Advocates and architects of economic sanctions will say that they are an alternative to war, a targeted measure to take out bad guys without firing a bullet. But the hidden history of economic sanctions shows that they're often more lethal to civilian populations than any gun, gas, or megaton bomb. Join us as we uncover this history and explain how this tremendous weapon actually works. In a speech in Seattle in September 1919, US President Woodrow Wilson set out in detail the logic of sanctions. He said an absolute isolation that brings a nation to its senses just as suffocation removes from the individual all inclinations to fight. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy and there will be no need for force. It is a terrible remedy. It does not cost a life outside of the nation boycotted, but it brings a pressure upon that nation which, in my judgment, no modern nation could resist. He concluded, the boycott is an infinitely more terrible instrument of war. The original impulse for a system of economic sanctions dates from this period, but not for reasons you might think. To make sense of sanctions' origins, we have to go back to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference following the World War I. There we meet British delegate Lord Robert Cecil and his French counterpart, Léon Bourgeois. These men were unlikely partners. Cecil, an aristocratic barrister and renegade member of the Conservative Party, was a fervent free trader who became Britain's first minister of blockade during the war. Bourgeois, the son of a Republican watchmaker, worked his way up the professions to become a radical party prime minister in the 1890s and advocated a political theory of mutual aid known as solidarism. But despite these different backgrounds, both Cecil and Bourgeois agreed that the League of Nations, the forerunner to the UN, could and should be equipped with a powerful instrument of war. Recalcitrant countries would be labeled aggressors, a new morally loaded legal category, and be subjected to economic isolation by the entire League. Many of the architects of this new system believed that they were simply keeping the peace without firing a bullet. In the words of Léon Bullock, speaking in September 1912 to the Universal Peace Congress in Geneva, the goal of sanctions was straightforward: tuer la guerre, to kill war. But President Wilson was right. What made this sanctions regime a truly new institution was not that they could isolate states from global trade and finance. It was that this coercive exclusion could take place in peacetime. USA in your Chevrolet, America is asking you to call. So how exactly do sanctions work? The answer to that question is actually more complex than you might think. In the past, it was a straightforward embargo. Think of the blockade Cuba has faced for over 60 years. The US made it illegal for any country to transact or even travel to the island. total economic isolation. But since then, the lethal art of sanctions has been refined, sharpened, and targeted, or so they say. Today, sanctions can be based on a list of specific people or corporations. These are known as smart sanctions, or they can be sectoral, prohibiting transactions with entire sectors of the economy. Or they can target a country's central bank or reserves. For example, the UK is holding and refusing to release around $2 billion worth of Venezuela's gold that is held in the Bank of England. But these targeted sanctions are not so targeted after all. Instead, they invariably trickle down to harm the entire populations they supposedly want to save. If a government has fewer resources, for example, it will be able to provide fewer services for its people. Bringing a sector to its knees to take another clearly affects the jobs in that industry and the families and communities those jobs support. But the effects are not always direct. In fact, indirect consequences can be even more impactful. For example, sanctions create huge amounts of legal uncertainty, complexity, and outright fear, which drive business away from areas of a country or its economy that technically aren't even sanctioned. For example, George H.W. Bush threatened the Nicaraguan people with sanctions if they elected the Sandinistas. Or in 2015, President Barack Obama fined the French bank BNP Paribas a whopping $9 billion for unlawfully opening the US financial markets to Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. Now imagine you are a bank compliance manager. Would you take on a non-sanctioned customer from a sanctioned country after seeing what happened to the firm next door? This is what is known as over-compliance, and it's causing massive damage to the global economy. PayPal, for example, will cancel a transaction if you put the word Cuba anywhere in the description, even if you're buying a Cuban sandwich for a friend or a Cuba Libre cocktail for a date. Multiply these transactions across the entire global economy, and you can begin to see the scale of the over-compliance crisis. Sanctions are not just a weapon. They are a geopolitical drill, creating new fault lines in the global order. The idea was once to isolate adversaries, but now sanctions have become the foreign policy key that fits all locks, the first and the last tactic deployed to keep down our enemies and their friends. In recent years, a more expansive model of sanctions has been developed and deployed, so-called secondary sanctions. These secondary sanctions target individuals and companies that have nothing to do with the country imposing the sanctions. For example, the US has imposed secondary sanctions on Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That means the US can seek to penalize anyone or any organization wherever they are in the world, regardless of nationality or jurisdiction, who does business with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or donates to its charities. These secondary sanctions are enforced even if the transactions have nothing to do with the US, use of its currency, financial system, or products. Unlike primary sanctions, which can be enforced by fines and the seizure of US-held assets, secondary sanctions rely on the centrality of the US financial system to the world economy and the widespread use of the US dollar as the global reserve currency to work. A company or individual that violates a secondary sanction could be hit by US export controls or be placed on the Treasury Department's specially designated nationals and block persons list, which would prevent Americans from doing business with it. To some, this looks like justice, but for many around the world, it looks like a warning. Do as the US and EU want, or else.
We will prevail.
Freedom will prevail.
The result of these turbocharged sanctioned regimes is a dangerous pattern of fragmentation. If the end of history after the Cold War brought hyperglobalization, rapid integration, and forced elimination of trade or financial restrictions, today we see talk of friendshoring, of values-based supply chains, of regionalized blocs designed to protect governments from the crossfire of economic weaponry. This fragmentation could end up supercharging the new sanctions regime. Looking across an increasingly multipolar world, the US and its allies could decide to double down, to isolate all nations who do not decide to play by the rules of their free world. But it could also herald much larger changes and challenges to that system. We are seeing signs of it already. Countries are exploring ways to sell their asset in currencies other than the US dollar. Even long-standing US ally, Saudi Arabia, has recently stated that it is open to breaking with 50 years of policy and selling its oil in currencies other than the greenback. Countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are stepping up their efforts at regional integration, which could limit the power of the US and the EU and their sanctions regime. Development banks such as the BRICS Bank are investing without needing US dollars. We can't predict the success of these challenges or how the sanctions regime will respond to being challenged, directly and indirectly in such a way. But we can say that the new reality of the sanctions regime is still a force more tremendous than war in reshaping the global economic and political order.